Welcome to Champions of Data and AI. I'm your host, Alex Mysak, Sales Director at Databricks, and I'm delighted today to welcome James Cummings. James is the Global VP of Data, of Analytics and Insight from Mars Wrigley's. Welcome, James. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
Perhaps for viewers, it would be very helpful to give a quick overview of Mars as the conglomerate, which is obviously much larger than confectionery brands they're aware of, and also your role within it.
Sure. So the Mars organization itself is split into three divisions. We have the Mars Wrigley organization that I'm responsible for, where we're really focused on building a next generation snacking organization. Some of the brands that you might be familiar with would include Snickers, Maltesers, of course, Wrigley Gum, to name but a few. Then we have, a lot of people don't realize we actually have a very significant pet care business that has multiple divisions that includes pet food as well as veterinary services. And then we have a foods division. Now, within that, I'm responsible specifically for insights and analytics for the demand function, so focused specifically on marketing and sales within the snacking business itself. And I think one of the things that really makes my role unique and very, very rewarding is that I have accountability for both the big data and the analytics side, as well as the human understanding and the thick data, and bringing those things together so that we can really, link things that are apparently unrelated to reveal something that wouldn't otherwise be seen, to really tackle complex problems from a multi-dimensional standpoint, and to make sure that we're not only addressing the business issues, but we're always putting the consumer first, and that we have a human lens on what we're putting into market, because if the consumer wins, then ultimately our customer wins and we win, and we get that amazing win-win-win situation.
Fascinating. I know we're going to come to some questions specifically around your projects in a second. Something you mentioned to me in prep, though, exploring a more personal side of you, is that you mentioned you're pursuing a PhD program on business administration. Would love to hear your motives with the busy job you have every day and taking that up.
Sure. So, I'm studying at the University of Rhode Island. I think that my biggest strength and my biggest weakness is that I am infinitely curious. And I really needed to make sure that I had a channel to pursue that curiosity and to actually to spend time studying the things that I'm most fascinated with, and to really get to a level of uncommon understanding so that I could bring that kind of next generation, next level leadership into the organization. So I'm very much focused on complexity theory, and how you can create value from analytics in complex adaptive systems, which I think is super relevant to working in large corporations like Mars Wrigley.
Interesting. And so with that perspective, and perhaps even bringing in your beliefs around complexity theory, if you had to pick three takeaways, perspectives on leadership, managing people or managing yourself, what would be the three things that spring most relevantly to mind?
So, three things. I think that the first rule that I live by, that was instilled in me by my first boss, is accomplishments before announcements. Make sure that we are delivering something that is extremely high value before we announce it to the world. Not least of which because it is a complex environment and things change. The second thing is a very practical one. The first rule of statistics, which being that averages hide more than they reveal. Make sure that we're constantly striving to dig deeper and to de-average. And then the third one, it's interesting because my first boss told me that as a leader, your first job is to create a win for the company. Your second job is to create a win for the people reporting to you, and the third job is to create a win for yourself. But what I've really learned is that actually, if you just focus on creating a winning environment for the team, then the company will inevitably win. The individuals within the team will win.
Yeah.
So I'm really, really focused on building the team, and the team as being the emphasis for leadership.
I honestly love that. And given that we're a hyper-growth company, we're constantly reevaluating our stance on these things. So thank you so much for sharing. just going into the business a little bit, if you don't mind, you have a ton of experience in CPG, from Energizer Personal Care to Anheuser-Busch to Mars. Could you then share your perspectives, as you mentioned, about how you transform a business and create value through data and AI? Would love if there's any views on that complexity theory that you're so interested in.
Sure. So I think that the starting point, I mean, the question is how do you create value through data and AI? And yeah. I believe the starting point is having a very, very clear view as to what value means. And I'm very lucky within Mars Wrigley that the chief sponsor for One Demand Data and Analytics, which is our demand level analytics organization, is a CFO. And like any good CFOs, he's made it very clear to me, my job is to create a minimum of $500 million in incremental MAC with an expected return ratio of an absolute minimum of 5-to-1 relative to investment. So in that sense, having very clear expectations and alignments up front is the starting point. But if we can sort of get beyond that, and I'm going to put to one side, important foundational components like data strategy, tech stack, specific tools. From my standpoint, value creation from data and analytics is actually an organizational capability. So the first thing is that really the data and analytics team need to stretch their perspective to be beyond their own boundaries. It's about managing the organization rather than simply managing the things that you own. And that end-to-end capability, it isn't about getting fixated on use cases or tools, but really looking at processes, organization and incentives through people's targets and KPIs, through the skills of the organization at large, and through culture. Now, it's worth saying within that the one that I find tends to get ignored or put to one side, but is actually the most important. It isn't sexy, but at the end of the day, it's business processes. Digital transformation starts with the changing of macro and micro business processes, which will ultimately define where analytics use cases live or die. And gaining advantage from data and analytics is going to require us to change the frequency, the intensity, and the complexity of decision making. And really, within my world, we're really seeing that with both a performance lens on our marketing, on our digital commerce, as well as our sales organization more broadly. I think the other thing that's critical is it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Right? There's so many use cases, but it's really critical to create sustainable value by building programs rather than products. I think there's a tendency and an inclination for analytics teams to gravitate to the most complex or the most sexy solutions at times. But it's really critical that we take a holistic perspective, that we manage holistically, that we have the capacity to adapt, and that we really make sure that we're not getting ourselves into technical data or analytic debt, and that we're solving both the foundational issues as well as delivering, high-end, front-end solutions that people can see in the business. And then the last thing is we really need to make sure we recruit key leaders. And I think that one of the best things about my job is that the CFO is my chief sponsor. The president of Mars Wrigley is a key stakeholder who's actively engaged and is willing to help remove roadblocks. And fundamentally, that is the difference oftentimes between success and failure. And having those, I think I alluded to it earlier, but having those aligned expectations with an integrated strategy that's linked to transformation goals, because most of the time I've seen digital transformations fail because there's a misalignment of expectations between the data and analytics organization and the leadership. And where that manifests itself most specifically is, most CPG businesses that I know of are trying to manage two gearboxes. On one hand, you're trying to generate or create the business and enable the business of tomorrow, while at the same time, you're trying to automate and make the business of today much more efficient. And if you don't have clear alignment as to where you're going to deliver against those two goals, then you set yourself up for failure.
So if I hear you, you just shared so many good takeaways for leaders, be them early in their journey for data and AI or those that are much more advanced. If you saw me typing as you were going along, it was because I wanted to try and capture them some for just to quickly summate. I think probably some of the most consistent trends that we see from our vantage point as leaders of data and AI at Databricks. First of all, being clear what you mean by value, particularly the value that you're trying to quantify with data and AI. 100%. Could be a POC or it could be a project and a partnership that we're putting together with a customer. It's so important to be aligned on what it means to drive value. Also, the fact that data and AI needs to be an organizational competency. Clearly, firms are at different stages of that journey. It's wonderful to hear that at Mars Wrigley, you seem to be further along, as is Shell and some of the other people that we've had on here. But the average organization we speak to is probably still quite early in that journey. And so therefore, avoidance of tech debt, even if it is for data and AI, super, super important. And then the recruitment of leaders aligned through consistent transformation goals, because ultimately you can want to implement data and AI policies, but it has to be more than just one team or a smattering of leaders. It needs to be an organizational effort. So I think in order to be able to achieve all of that, it's a sprint, not a marathon. Did I hear you correctly?
You got it.
Just such great takeaways. Thank you for sharing, James. Okay, let's pivot just a little bit. Driving change at multinational Fortune 500 companies that have been around for more than 100 years isn't an easy task. Could you talk then about your experience in change management and leading teams?
Sure. So this is where you'll see my inclination towards complexity theory really kind of lean in a little bit. And you need to be careful, because the reality is that a large organization like Mars Wrigley and many others, they really are highly complex adaptive systems. You have significant variations in the level of maturity and transformation readiness by function, by market, and by region. And in that sense, and just a quick shout out to my change manager, Stephanie. Please don't take offense at this, but starting with the assumption that you can manage and control that change, I believe is actually the first point of failure. And that you really need to I believe the data and analytics organizations need to take the mindset that it's not about control, but it's about enablement. Our job is to accelerate and enable the changes that are already happening in the business. And ideally, through the creation of adaptive spaces in part, we can start to create internal competition by going to the areas where there are energy, by working as facilitators, accelerating that change, enabling others in the organization to see that effect, and then creating that virtuous cycle within the business where there is an internal desire to change, to adopt, to experiment. And my experience has been is when you take a very strong top-down view. Excuse the analogy, but I have two dogs, and one thing that I'm not calling anybody that I work with a dog, incidentally, but one thing I guarantee is that when I pull hard in one direction on the lead because they're poorly trained by me, in all honesty, they push back hard in the opposite direction. When I keep the lead slack, then they're actually much better behaved. So I really see our job as being enablers, as being absolutely critical. And if you think about what that means, it's really balancing top down and bottom up with extremely agile governance, managing that balance between flexibility and structure. I mean, structure's like salt. We would put too much in, it's going to spoil the dish, right? Having empathy towards the business and being very considerate of change fatigue. The reality is that I think most businesses are in states of constant invention and reinvention. And being sensitive to when's the right time to push and where's the right time to push. I think one of the things that's really critical is embracing the shadows, and making sure that we're focused on how we're useful versus what we own. Oftentimes in large organizations, you'll find that there are analytics projects that are potentially happening outside of the formal analytics organization. The tendency I've noticed for centralized analytics functions is to try and close those down to control and replace it. But actually, if you engage with those initiatives, if you make yourself useful and make the best of them, then you can create a win-win whereby your analytics team stand to learn something, because clearly there was a need that was not being met. And at the same time, you can ensure that the analytics delivery is as strong as it possibly can be, because let's face it, the enemy is not internal in so much as the enemy is anyone who wishes to increase the data and analytics IQ of the organization to overcome any inertia that already exists. Is actually an ally, and we need to work with them, because the enemy itself for data and analytics is the status quo in the past. And then I think the last thing, it's a very, very practical thing from that sense, is making sure that we're identifying very clear product champions in the business, making sure they have the right mindset from the perspective of being innovative and having a learning organization who are going to drive that early adoption of change in the business, in the situation, because there's only so much that you can accomplish from the outside. Now, I think that's half of it. The other half of enabling change from my standpoint comes back to the point I was making earlier about teams, but it's actually really about people. And perhaps what's most important is as a leader, promote mobility for the analytics teams internally. And because at the end of the day, change management is really about bringing the business closer to analytics and the analytics closer to the business. And the best way of accomplishing that is finding those people who have a high degree of agility within your analytics organization, and creating the opportunity for them to extend their career into other parts of the business, so that one, they can maybe understand the business and much better and bring it back to the analytics organization in the future, or alternatively, they can serve as beacons for analytics and for change. They can be that 70% of the organization in providing that day-to-day coaching and mentoring, which really makes a difference. Because as I think you know, Alex, if you're entirely dependent on top-down formal training to deliver your change and your skills, then usually you'll fail. And then, of course, the last piece is just, from a change management standpoint, and again, from a complexity standpoint, the data and analytics environment is constantly changing. Change in and of itself is a network effect. It's also an outcome of people. It's a people-driven outcome. But we really need to, as leaders, think about how we're constantly changing our team composition and our leadership model to reflect the fact that the environment is constantly changing. Make sure we've got our fingers on the pulse of the skills and capabilities of the future, and have a strong but agile strategy on where we're going to hire, where we're going to acquire, where we're going to rent, what we're going to train, because it's only through having the right blend of internal expertise that you can really deliver the change that you're looking for.
Yeah. Well, as they say, what got us here won't get us there. So there is a very important need to be agile. I'm actually very curious. You talked a lot about people, which I would expect. You talked also a lot about the processes. What role do you see the actual tech tooling play? And particularly when you were introducing yourself, you were talking about the importance of not building up tech debt. So in a Fortune 500 company that's been around, I've worked for some of them as well, there's a lot of band-aids that are internally applied to the infrastructure. Any thoughts around the role that tooling plays within that transformation?
So I think from my standpoint, I think it's worth noting that I'm a front-end guy, right? So I'm really focused on the value creation, and I'm really focused on the teams. The teams themselves, building the capabilities, understanding the models and the tools. One of the things that really stands out in Mars Wrigley is the relationships that the analytics teams have with what might be considered in other organizations the internal IT organization. both the internal organization that sits within the segment and the organization that sits at a corporate level. Because at the end of the day, value creation is a team sport. We need to make sure that as an organization, we're providing a very clear view as to what the analytics roadmap needs to look like, that we have a clear and structured data strategy, so that our partners in other parts of the organization can make sure that the tech tooling is in place to help to deliver the outcomes.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, so talking about the use of technology, and without disclosing any trade secrets, what was the most exciting data initiative that you've worked on in your career, and any advice or learnings to be shared?
Wow. So there's a question. So look, it's a difficult question to answer because I think only from the standpoint that I think there's one project that's sort of been consistent and ongoing for probably the last sort of 5 years of my career, and one that just continues to get more interesting over time. And that is really helping to answer the question as to how large CPG organizations can win in an increasingly complicated sort of omnichannel environment. At the end, talk about complexity, right? And specifically, I think that what's critical to that is the delivery of connected insights. And I think the role of analytics organizations in breaking down the silos. At the end of the day, my observation is that within any specific domain, I think that most organizations actually have access to quite similar capabilities, but it's how those are used to really understand the complex interaction effects, whether it's between media and pricing, between online and offline, between traditional retailer media and search. So really helping to solve those big problems, because at the end of the day, I'm an old school insights guy at heart, and I firmly believe our job is to combine things that are apparently unrelated to reveal something that wouldn't otherwise be seen, because that's where proprietary knowledge sits. Mm-hmm. And I think what I'm actually advocating for here is for data scientists to look beyond the obvious, see silos as a challenge, really look for the independencies and be curious, and then an invitation to the industry at large to combine big and thick data, sometimes intuition, because that's the only way that we're gonna solve these big problems. Bearing in mind that a certain amount of knowledge exists within our systems and within our tools, but a large amount of knowledge in how to solve these problems is actually tacit and lives in the heads of our stakeholders. And solving these big problems requires us to use the tools that we have, but also to really extract the knowledge, the unwritten business rules, some of the heuristics that exist in the business, in order to find different novel solutions. There's always that old adage, right? If you find something interesting, then it's probably wrong. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes, we need to keep digging. And what keeps me coming back to this job is that sense of curiosity, and the desire to take something that I don't understand today, to look in unusual places and really get under it and understand what's going on.
So thank you for all of the shares that you have had on what you've been doing over the last 20-ish years. In summation, what career advice, what would you distill it down to if you had to give career advice for someone aspiring to build a career in data and AI? What would you say to them?
Well, I'd start with, don't forget that averages hide more than they reveal. And maybe accompany that with all models are wrong, but some are useful. But look, in all seriousness, as a fellow Brit, I've got a college-age child, right? And one of the things that I'm incredibly jealous of, actually, is the American liberal arts college experience, where people have the opportunity to delve in and understand a multitude of subjects. I think that too often we're forced by our educational systems to specialize too soon. So my recommendation is get a broad education. Don't underestimate the importance of critical thinking and creativity. It's not all about statistics and programming languages. It's actually that ability to combine things and to see things in a way that others don't that will really help you to stand out in your career. I think then related, once you get into it, because this may sound a bit contradictory, but I'm quite comfortable with a paradox. But as you get into the business, and start at the beginning of your career, be prepared to start small. Find an area of passion. That's what's most important. Build your expertise, and then you can expand from there. Data and AI is a hugely broad field. It can be one that you can very easily get lost in. There's no need to boil the ocean. Find the thing that you're passionate about, get really good at it, and then find something else. And eventually, you'll find yourself where you want to be. That's certainly how I manage my career. Seek mentorship. Build your network. At the end of the day, look, knowledge and learning is a social process. It's really about people with problems connecting to different kinds of people with answers. And if you do that enough times, you'll actually create a proprietary knowledge and understanding for yourself that other people don't have. So don't rely solely what's in the books or what you find on the web. Get out and talk to people. And then lastly, a learning mindset. The sad thing is today's tech's going to be obsolete in 3 to 5 years. So no one can afford to stand still. Keep learning, keep moving forward.
So I love that. I actually spoke to my former CEO at Symphony this week, and the three takeaways that he always instilled on us. One of them was be the consummate student. So you got that learning mindset. He also used to say, I told you the bon courage instead of good luck. I think that's slightly different, but he absolutely did talk about start small. And there's a phrase in French, petit à petit, l'oiseau fait son nid, which means like a little bit by little bit, the bird builds its nest. And all it means is the accumulation of all the small activities will end up bringing around like a very worthwhile goal. And so your advice on starting small is something that, at least in the last decade of knowing him, he used to instill in us. As a former equity broker, I used to have to think about connecting the dots in a differentiated way as well. So I couldn't agree more with all of your takeaways and mentorship, building the network. Thank you for sharing all of that, James. Okay, last prediction for us, ending this interview today. So if you're to forecast data and AI for the next 3 years, what is your top one prediction?
Do you mind if I give you more than one?
No, go on.
Okay. So let me just start with the obvious and just get it out of the way, and then we can talk about something more interesting. We're going to see more applications and use cases for quantum computing and the metaverse. Right, done. Move on. I think my hope is that we're not talking about AI, because I'm really concerned that AI itself is developing a branding issue. I think it's become a catch-all term that's overused to sell algorithmic solutions, and oftentimes used as a shorthand for too complex to understand. And I really think that's already, and it's going to damage the industry if we're not careful. So I think we need to really dimensionalize what we mean and maybe be a little bit less lazy in that term. But most importantly, my hope is that the base level of comfort for people outside of analytics organizations with complex models is going to increase. We get much more comfortable with complexity, really understanding that on one hand, the situation is so complex we can't understand it entirely by ourselves, and there's actually more data than we know how to use right now. But that we become comfortable with that ambiguity and realistic about the role of simulation and optimization alongside qualitative inputs and scenario-based thinking, because I think that combination is really going to help us to solve big problems and move a lot of things forward.
So, James, I can't thank you enough. Many of the observations and experiences you shared today have been something that I think are very thought-provoking to all of the viewers here. I'd like to just recap and say, embrace the shadows. Structure is like salt. enemy is the status quo. May we all reflect for a few moments after everything shared by James today. Thank you so much for joining us on Champions of Data in AI.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure.